Hello, my name is Jacob Monk. Welcome to this little video about two very interesting books. These two books, they're both written in Danish, so I suppose you won't understand them. And I'm afraid to say they are not going to be translated into English. They are unique books because they are written during the first years of the Protestant Reformation in Denmark. Well, one of the books is written quite recently, but the events it talks about and the documents it builds on, they are all written in the period from 1536 until 1622. But let's start up with the first book of these two interesting and very unique books. Even in Denmark, they are very hard to buy, but you can try to buy them used from an antiquarian. That's what I did. Book number one, called Skibby-Krøniken. Skibby-Krøniken. You know, the Reformation in Denmark, 1536, it led to a dictatorship of the king, and it led to the absolute opposite of religious freedom. Although Luther, he talked about we want religious freedom instead of Roman Catholic religion. Well, the factual result of the Reformation was a Lutheran dictatorship. And this book here, Skibby-Krøniken, quite hard to translate. Skibby, that's a name of a little town around 60 or 70 kilometers from Copenhagen. And in this town there was a small church. And the priest in this church before the Reformation was called Paul Helgesen. Paul Helgesen, he was a Carmelite monk living in a monastery in Helsingør. That is another town around 30 kilometers north of Copenhagen. This Carmelite monk, he was a very learned person. He was a professor at the university in Copenhagen until the Reformation. There he had a lot of discussions with Hans Tausen, the leaders of the Lutherans in Copenhagen. But you know, first of all, the Reformation was made by the Danish king called Christian III. And the reason was that he wanted to take over all the values of the church. The church owned around 40% of the ground in Denmark, and they had a lot of other values that they have had from their members during the past 500 years. So Christian III was a devoted follower of Luther because he understood that Lutheran philosophy, Lutheran religion was the way to make himself rich. And therefore Catholic religion was outlawed after the Reformation. And therefore Paul Helgesen, who wrote this book, he had to flew away from Denmark. No one knows what happened to him, but he was not found anywhere in Denmark 30 years after the Reformation. Maybe he was killed, maybe he just flew to another country. For sure, his monastery, his Carmelite monastery in Helsingør, it was closed down and forbidden. It was used to store up horses and other things from agricultural production in the year after the Reformation. But this book here, the reason it is so unique is that this is the only book written, the only history book written after the Reformation, in the first century after the Reformation, about what happened before the Reformation, all the events that led up to the Reformation. This book here, it was written in Latin, but it has since then been translated into Danish, and it was found in the walls of the church in Skiby, year 1650. That means that the author, Professor Paul Helgesen, he chose to hide this book away because to make any kind of Catholic propaganda could lead to a death sentence after the Reformation. We had a dictatorship, a very, very brutal dictatorship. The king, he took over all the values of the church. We had no religious freedom. The children in the school had to repeat Lutheran formulas and Lutheran documents and prayers all over and all over and all over again. So this was a time where Denmark could be compared to, I would say, Saudi Arabia today. It was brutal, it was inhuman, it was a dictatorship. But that is the consequence of Lutheranism, because in Lutheranism, you know, the power is taken away from the Pope and the Church and given to the king and the local rulers. And of course, they're going to misuse this power. That is why they wanted to have it. You can read about all what led up to the Lutheran Reformation. Well, every small detail, this book, it goes from around year 1100 up until around year 1536. 1536, where the Reformation was fulfilled in Denmark, and all the Catholic bishops were jailed by the king, and they had to starve in jail, and all of them, they died within 6 or 7 years. And then there was no legal Catholic Church in Denmark anymore. Well, years later, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in Copenhagen, they asked to have a house chapel, actually a small Catholic church, installed close to their embassy. And because the Danish king, he wanted to have a good relationship to the Austrian emperor, therefore he said yes. And that way the Catholic Church was slowly started up again until 1849, where our constitution, our first constitution, was made, and it was decided that we could have some kind of religious freedom. Not full religious freedom. Still today, 2017, we do not have full religious freedom in Denmark. All Catholics, Muslims, Jews, atheists, we all have to pay to the Lutheran Church. This is the result of the Reformation. I could go through a lot of the details in this book, but I won't do it because the book is very interesting, but it is also hard to understand if you don't know the specific events happening during the Middle Age and the Reformation in Denmark. Here I take one specific sentence from page number 70. Here the author, Paul Helgesen, Catholic professor and theologian, Carmelite monk, he wrote, "The tyrannic, the dictatorial events made by the king was fulfilled. What especially happened was that the citizens in Stockholm, they were forced to drown 6 monks from a Cistercian monastery." Well, you know, Sweden was a part of Denmark at that time. And the Danish king, he ruled Sweden too. And here, Paul Helgesen, he writes about the way that the Protestant treated the Catholic monks. 6 of them were drowned in a little town outside Stockholm. The Catholic bishops in Denmark, they were put in jail and starved there. They all died that way. The leader of the Catholics, Skipper Clement in Jutland, the one part of Denmark, he lived in Aalborg. He was beheaded. First he was tortured and then he was beheaded. Well, the Reformation in Denmark was not a peaceful event. It was a civil war. And the only reason it was won by the Lutherans was that the king, he wanted to have the values of the church. You can read about this in quite a few English language books, but here you have the original source, Skibby-krøniken, an absolute unique document. You can read the original written in Latin in the Royal Library in Copenhagen. This is a Danish translation. Well, I also have another book, but I'll make it very short. This is a book about Jesuit priest. He was a Norwegian, and in late 1500, after the Reformation, he went to a Catholic school, a Jesuit school in Europe, and there he was educated as a priest, and after that he went secretly to Sweden to talk to the Swedish queen. This book, it is written 40 years ago. It's very hard to find in Denmark. The first edition came out 1966. It is called Laurentius Nicolai Norvegicus S.J. It's a biography with contributions to enlighten the Roman Church attempts to reinstall Catholic religion in Denmark and Norway in the time after the Reformation. The book looks like this and is absolutely unique. You have to understand that the Jesuit order, they tried to reinstall Catholic religion. First of all in Sweden, because in Sweden they had a king, Johann II, who was very much pro-Catholic. And they also had a queen. The king, he had a queen. She came from Poland. Poland was a Catholic country. And therefore the Jesuits worked at the royalty, with the royalty in Sweden. And this man here, Laurentius Nicolai Norvegicus, he came from Norway, then he was educated in Germany as a Catholic priest, and he was taken into the Jesuit order. He worked quite secretly, not telling anyone he was a Jesuit, but it worked to persuade the Swedish king to reinstall the Catholic religion. Well, unfortunately, he didn't succeed. But still today, many years after the Reformation, actually 500 years after the Reformation, Sweden is much more Catholic than Denmark. Denmark was a very anti-Catholic country, and still today Denmark is an anti-Catholic country. That's why Danes don't want to be fully member of the European Union. They are afraid that the euro is a papal currency, and if we have the euro in Denmark, then the Pope will rule us. This kind of paranoia isn't existing in Sweden, because in Sweden they have several queens that were pro-Catholic. You know, later on, the Queen Christina from Sweden, she laid down her royalty. She left Sweden and she converted to Catholic faith and lived the rest of her life in Rome. Now she's buried in the Peter's Church in the Vatican. But all of this you can read a lot about in this book, Laurentius Nicolai Novidius, also in Danish language called Klosterlasse, that is monastery lasse. This was a special word that this monk, his friends gave to him, and maybe also his enemies, because Klosterlasse is a kind of I would say, word that is used to propagate against the Jesuits. But Klosterlasse was a very intelligent person. He did a lot of good work trying to re-Catholize Scandinavia, but unfortunately he didn't succeed. But you can still read all about this if you find one of the used copies of this book here. Okay, thank you for listening.